So this last installment of the Feminist Literary Criticism lecture series is going up several days later than I wanted it to. Hopefully I will also start posting installments of the Queer Studies lecture series. Um, and hopefully I can catch up before you really start working on your final portfolios, the due date of which I may push back a few days, since I think I miscalculated when I have to have your grades uploaded into eCanvas, so that maybe I can give you a few more days so you can work on those. But anyway, point is I want to try to get caught up here, so you may get a slew of videos coming up today, tomorrow, and what day is it? And maybe Monday. Anyway, I apologize if it's just a lot and you can't watch it all at once. Maybe it'll be there when you have some time to go back and watch them. Anyway, I wanted to, in this last installment, go over, read a bit out loud from Mrs. Dalloway, again suggestively to try to unpack a little bit of how one might attend to the textual practice of what Woolf is doing, and see that there might be a feminist project at work in the novel, despite the fact that, according to a certain mode of feminist literary criticism, Woolf doesn't really offer us much in the way of what some critics might call authentic experiences of women that we could use to oppose and correct and subvert, as it were, misrepresentations of women in other novels or in contemporary media. Although Woolf might not offer us that directly, following the lead of Toril Moi, maybe if we attend to her textual practice, reorient ourselves theoretically, maybe there is something nevertheless happening. Okay. I also want to reiterate before I turn to Woolf, partly because I rewatched the last installment of this lecture series and realized I was reading a lot more than I had intended, without really offering much in the way of explication. And that might be okay in some ways. I really want you to read these articles and these texts on your own and figure them out, as opposed to me just telling you what they mean all the time. And sometimes all you need is a kind of suggestive reading, or someone to read passages out loud, pausing in certain places, and just offering a sentence or two here or there by way of annotation to really bring those texts to life. So maybe it's not too big of a deal that I read most of the time, as opposed to talking to you or reading a lecture. But I want to just reiterate that for Toril Moi, if we think of the stage 2 and stage 3 feminisms she discusses as modes of second and third wave feminism, it's important to keep in mind that for her, these two waves need to work together. They may be in conflict, sort of the way in which Toril Moi sees herself, in what we might call a conflict with Elaine Showalter, a theoretical conflict. For her, it's very clear that we need both of these projects, right? We need projects that oppose, as it were, a millennia of misrepresentations of women's experience, or misdiagnoses of women's experience in our culture and in cultural productions and in media. It's important to subvert and oppose those things with a political project that is very much centered around and geared toward policies and ideas and concepts and movements concerning the equality and the excellence of women. Right? That's still important for Moi, is making very clear there. But at the same time, theoretically, she's arguing that in a partnership, right, maybe a tense partnership with that kind of politics and with that kind of scholarship, even, which Showalter championed and is such an exemplary model of, that there is nevertheless this other theoretical project that should very much be about always shining light on the ways in which that project can sometimes unwittingly be drawn into complicity with patriarchal models, right? And whether that involves, as it does for Moy, a sort of deconstructive practice of undoing the very binaries of masculinity and femininity that are at the crux, are at the center of patriarchy, and in some sense, unquestioned terms. I'm not quite unquestioned, but are still very much the terms of some second wave literary criticism that nevertheless, what am I saying? Who knows? This happens sometimes. That for third wave feminism, there needs to be that kind of work of always undoing, unpacking, showing that they're cultural constructions, that they, that the very binary itself and the maintenance of the binary itself might lead to somewhat unhappy consequences, like, for instance, and both Nicholson, who I read earlier in this lecture series, and Parker both point out the ways in which the focus on experience, on authentic experience, for much second wave criticism that extols the experience, the personhood, the value, right, of women. One negative consequence of that is that there is a danger that the experience of women can kind of become universalized, in the sense that any woman of any age, of any generation, of any sexuality, of any ethnicity, right, any moment in history, somehow shares the same experience, right? And there is a concern that kind of experience often tends to be white, white middle class, white and middle class, and of a certain age. And for that very reason, right, you have Toril Moy, who wants to do a more theoretical challenge to those binary oppositions, unpack them a little bit. Judith Butler does the same thing in her seminal book, Gender Trouble. And then you also have texts like Saba Mahmood's Politics of Piety, The Islamic Revival and the Feminist Subject, which this was published in 2005, so still, and I think a second edition a second edition of it came out a few years ago, which tries to show that the theoretical models of Western feminism, often whether second or third wave, sometimes don't get after or aren't very useful tools for giving an account of the experience of women that seems somehow antithetical to the project of feminism. So, for instance, in this book, Mahmood, as an anthropologist, for writing this book, she spent years doing field research among an Islamic women's movement in Egypt, right? And just that phrase, Islamic women's movement, seems somewhat counterintuitive to many Western sensibilities, right? And in fact, for many secular theorists and critics, you could say the same thing of a women's Christian movement, that there's something antithetical to that idea, right? Because for some feminism, there's a certain clear notion of what it means to be a free agent, right? And an active agent in society. And there's a sense for many theoretical and critical feminisms that religion itself is a sort of patriarchal culprit in limiting the freedoms of women. And so what does it mean to try to step outside of that for a moment and investigate these sorts of agency and the activities of freedom that are at work in a religious community like the one that Mahmood is studying? And so in that case, she's attempting to show that we need to step outside a little bit of contemporary feminist paradigms in order to give a better account of the ways in which to give a better account of activities that would remain invisible to those paradigms. So anyway, so that is just a quick overview again of the relationship between second and third wave feminism, which again is a kind of reductive distinction to begin with. So I almost feel sorry, that's my email ding. I almost feel like I'm doing you a disservice to continue holding on to those terms, but maybe that's Toril Moy's influence, Toril Moy and Derrida's influence, to say always kind of peck at and undo the sort of binary oppositions that that we rely on in order to explain what we're studying. And so I would caution you to do the same with second and third wave feminism, that they're not, the terms aren't quite as distinct as we might think they are. And in fact, Nicholson's volume, which I showed you before, The Second Wave, includes a lot of writers that Parker, for instance, would think of as third wave, right? So where's the third wave here? So that's a somewhat instructive example of the way in which, for some theorists and historians, the very conflicts I'm talking about are still part of the second wave anyway. So, all right. So I've already talked more than I wanted to about that. On to Mrs. Dalloway. Okay. In fact, maybe I'll just make a new video of that. Okay.